This episode contains images and descriptive content regarding a crime that some might find disturbing. It is not recommended for younger audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. In my time, I've met a lot of people who embrace witchcraft. Most are among some of the nicest and most kind-hearted people I know. How you interpret the craft depends on your perspective. Some accept all witchcraft as sharing the same elements and beliefs, but that's not really the case. In most cases, the practices are benign and used as a form of empowerment, but all too often it's associated with black or dark magic and used with bad intentions. This next account demonstrates how witchcraft was used in a small town to convince some vulnerable and disenfranchised people that pure evil would be their road to salvation. The story is both disturbing and extremely strange. At the height of the Iraq War, Joshua Bennett, who was raised by his father in the small town of Mattoon, Illinois, joined the United States Army. Josh had enrolled in the JROTC program while at Mattoon High and enlisted upon his graduation in 2004. By the following summer, Josh completed basic training in Louisiana, but before he was deployed, he learned his father Jerry had tragically passed away. He was granted bereavement leave to return home for the funeral. His parents had divorced in the early 90s, but Joshua remained very close to his father and was living with him at the time of his death. But though his mother and he had a somewhat estranged relationship, he nonetheless felt strongly that he should pay her a visit and perhaps begin to reconcile with her. What Josh could not have envisioned then, what no one could, was his return home, rather than a war in the Middle East, would result in his eventual demise. When he arrived home for the funeral, Josh reconnected with his mother Jacqueline, who was living with her boyfriend Lee Jackson in Claremont, Illinois. He called his girlfriend Jamie Hopper Talbert that night as he was about to sit down to dinner with them. She had visited there on a couple of occasions for cookouts, but chose to stay home that night. They planned to talk again the following day, but this would be the last time they would actually do so. In the early morning hours of the following day, August 23, 2005, Richland County Sheriff's Deputy Robert Blythe responded to the home after dispatch had received a frantic 911 call. Blythe was greeted at the house by a pregnant woman screaming that there had been a shooting and a stabbing inside the residence. When Blythe entered the home, he saw an unidentified man bleeding excessively as he crawled across the floor. He then heard someone shout to him, "Robbie, I shot him." It turned out to be Lee Jackson's son, Jackie, age 23, whom he was acquainted with. The man bleeding profusely on the floor from multiple chest stab wounds was Josh Bennett. A knife was spotted lying at his feet, but then another shocking discovery was made when Blythe found his mother Jacqueline sitting in a utility room with multiple stab wounds to her stomach. At this point, it was impossible for him to discern what had taken place or who might be responsible. Paramedics quickly arrived at the scene, but it was too late to save 20-year-old Joshua Bennett, who was pronounced dead of a substantial chest wound. Jackie Jackson would go on to tell Blythe what had taken place that morning. He was living at the house with his father and Jacqueline, along with his pregnant girlfriend, 17-year-old Lindsay Kasinger. Josh had come for dinner, and then around 3 a.m., he was in his basement bedroom when he was awakened by a chaotic noise upstairs and Josh calling for help. He told Lindsay to run to a nearby neighbor's house and then bolted up the stairs armed with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun. He then came upon two men in black clothing wearing ski masks in the act of stabbing Josh Bennett in the chest. He struck one of them with the butt end of the weapon and shot the other when the attacker attempted to wrest the gun away from him. Dropping the weapon, he then fought with the other intruder. During the struggle, the assailant stabbed himself in the leg, then fled the home, leaving behind his accomplice, who was bleeding profusely from the gunshot wound. Lindsay was already at the neighbor's house and had made the 911 call. As for Jacqueline, with her boyfriend Lee at work, she claimed to have awoken in the middle of the night and went into the kitchen when she heard their dog barking. There she came upon the two intruders. She was then brutally attacked by them, and her cries of pain awakened Josh, who rushed to his mother's defense, ultimately costing him his life. While being interviewed from his hospital bed by Detective Kelly Henby, the wounded man identified himself as 29-year-old David Lindner, and would only name his accomplice as Ricky. He soon slipped into a coma, but before he did, he revealed to detectives that the lady who lived in the house had, quote, placed a hex on them and had to be killed. At this point, catching the escaped assailant was a priority. Residents were told to shelter in place as the search for the suspect kicked into high gear. In the hospital, Jacqueline was devastated upon learning of her son's death, realizing he had saved her own life, but was able to tell investigators she had never heard of anyone named David Lindner, nor anything about a hex placed on him. An APB was put out to local hospitals to take notice of anyone being admitted with a stab wound, and by 8 a.m., the Lawrence County Memorial Hospital contacted them to report admitting a man with a stab wound to his thigh who wouldn't explain how it occurred. State Police Sergeant John Waggle responded to the call and saw 38-year-old Oscar Richard Eck limping out the front doors. He questioned the man, who said everyone called him Ricky. He told the officer he was just getting some air before heading back in for treatment, and that the injury happened while hanging drywall. After showing him the wound, Waggle was convinced Eck was not telling the truth. But soon a couple of his friends, Irenia Cotner, 34, and Jenny Wolfe, 20, arrived to give him a ride home. Sergeant Waggle noticed an obvious nervousness in Irenia, who was visibly shaking, avoiding eye contact with the officer. Eck was brought inside the hospital for treatment under police watch, while Cotner and Wolfe agreed to submit to questioning, but both women denied any knowledge of what had transpired earlier that morning. Yet Irenia's anxious and somewhat non-cooperative state, along with a lack of common curiosity as to what this was all about, still raised red flags. With no definitive proof of their involvement, they were told they were free to go. After running a background check on Oscar Eck, police visited his last known address, where they encountered ex-roommate Misty Gangloff, who initially said she didn't know anything about the attack, but while in the residence, investigators noticed the presence of a book on witchcraft. This seemed to at least suggest that claims of a hex may not be as odd as they previously assumed, so Gangloff was brought in for questioning. Once there, Misty revealed a treasure trove of information. She told investigators that she worked with Cotner and Wolfe at a nearby Walmart and admitted that all shared a common interest in witchcraft and the occult. She named Cotner as the self-styled leader of their Coven. At first, they would hold benign rituals designed to bring good luck or sage their homes to clear negative energies, but that soon evolved into conducting candlelit ceremonies and rites designed to clear themselves of curses and hexes. Cotner and Wolfe were especially close after Cotner helped Jenny leave an abusive home life, and she considered Irenia to be something of a mother figure. Not surprising, considered Irenia had a tendency to gravitate to people younger than she. As a cooperating witness, Gangloff told them in the spring of 2005, Cotner had informed them that a young woman named Lindsay Kasinger had placed a hex on her. She used the fact that a few of her dogs had previously died under strange circumstances to reinforce that idea, and further strengthened that assertion by telling Misty that this hex was also affecting those close to her, and that the bouts of depression and headaches Misty was dealing with were a result of it. The combination of the group's overall emotional vulnerability and Irina's controlling personality made taking the leap into a spell being placed on them much easier to accept. Another vital piece of information was the revelation that Jackie Jackson had previously had a 4-year relationship with Cotner, who was 11 years his senior. After leaving her and taking up with a younger woman, Irina was despondent and angry over the breakup. When Lindsay became pregnant with his child, the resentment spilled over into rage. Eventually, Misty introduced her roommate, Oscar Eck, to the group, and before long Irina convinced him that he too had been hexed by Lindsay. She then convinced them that the only means of counteracting it and reclaiming their lives was to kill the pregnant teen along with her unborn baby. At that point, fearful and thinking things had all gone too far, Misty claimed she ceased attending group sessions. Eck in his interview said that Cotner had convinced him and the others that Kasinger's hex was a threat to them as well as their families and friends, and so a plot was hatched to murder the girl. Driving to Jackson's house armed with a gun and knife, the plan was aborted when Jenny became too frightened to carry out the gruesome task. It was then that David Lindner, who fancied himself to be a warlock in the occult community, was recruited by Eck as an accomplice. On August 22nd, Cotner, Eck, Lindner, and Wolf gathered for a seance, with Cotner telling them they could ask yes or no questions, and that the flicker of the candles they employed would respond to them. Part of the spell including inscribing the intended victims' names on the candles. It was during this session that Irina said the candles signaled the time to strike was now, and they must do so before they burned out. Lindsay and her child therefore must be killed in a ritual sacrifice within that time, or their families would die. Cotner would enlist the assistance of demons to protect them during the gruesome task, but would not be present for it. She would instead remotely open a gate to hell, where Lindsay and her child's souls would be cast into it. In essence, a place to hide the bodies. While Wolf waited in the car outside, Eck and Lindner gained access to the house through a kitchen window left unlocked, and once inside came upon Jacqueline Bennett. In the darkness, thinking she was the intended target, they attacked her. And this is when Josh came to his mother's assistance and was stabbed to death by the men. Wolf claimed it was she who drove Eck back to Irina's house after the botched plan, and then on to the hospital while also disposing of his bloody clothing, after which the entire plan went horribly wrong, with 2 innocent people claimed as victims. Eck was then placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder and separate counts of home invasion. When Jenny and Irina were brought back for questioning, Jenny calmly and thoroughly laid out the entire plot, as well as how all of them had been manipulated by Irenia Cotner, who had preyed on their vulnerabilities by convincing them all the bad in their lives were the result of Lindsay Kasinger's hex. In an adjoining interrogation room, Irina proclaimed her innocence, but under heavy questioning by detectives, she eventually folded and admitted her intent was to have Lindsay Kasinger killed. After that, Cotner, Gangloff, and Wolf joined Eck as being placed under arrest. David Lindner never left the hospital and died of his injuries in February of 2006 before he could go to trial. That trial would begin in October 2006, and prosecutors made the case that in terms of the crime, hexes and witchcraft were a smokescreen, and that at its core was the desire of Irenia Cotner to take vengeance on a rival for the affections of Jackie Jackson, and that her elimination might rekindle their relationship. She had essentially used the others as tools in this plot. Eck, Gangloff, and Wolf, acting in their own best interest, testified against Cotner in court, asserting she was the ringleader of the entire scheme. Gangloff said she was with Cotner when they went to a bridge outside Claremont with a gun and fire-tested the weapon several times using a pillow and a milk carton to try to silence the gun. She further claimed that on the morning Eck returned home with Cotner to tend to his wound, sometime after 4 a.m., they repeatedly and distressingly stated that the plan had gone all wrong. For his part, Eck also claimed his interest in the occult was developed by watching vampire and Harry Potter movies. His goal in learning spells was to make money and become well-liked. On October 26, 2006, Gangloff accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 7 years after pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. She was released from prison in 2013. Eck pled guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and received a 20-year sentence. He's scheduled to be released in 2027. Wolf opted to go to trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder, home invasion, and conspiracy to commit murder. She was handed a 32-year sentence and will be released in 2040. And Cotner, the leader of this murderous coven, was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and home invasion, and sentenced to 57 years in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2063, when she will have turned 93 years old. After her verdict was read, Cotner, in a fit of anger, told the judge to, quote, "kiss my ass," as she was led from the courtroom. When it came to summarizing this story, I'm going to admit I had a hard time summing it up in just a few neat sentences. We first shouldn't fail to recognize the heroes here, one being Josh Bennett, who sacrificed his own life to save his mother's, and Jackie Jackson, whose bravery likely saved 2 more. And some bad people were put away, though many believe other than Irenia Cotner, they all got off pretty easy and will eventually rejoin society. But like, say, Charles Manson, Irenia Cotner really didn't commit a murder, but Don Eck did. And he was handed a relatively lighter sentence, as were those who aided and abetted the plot. With that said, may she rot away in prison for the rest of her natural life. In modern times, we think of a coven as a gathering of witches working spells in concert with each other. But what separates a coven from a cult has to do with the distinction between subservience and free will. Both may have recognized leaders, but cults are usually distinguished by one charismatic individual who's skilled and adept at getting people to listen to them and buy into their skewed perceptions of reality. Their followers don't feel capable of leading individualized lives outside of what's considered normal within the group. Couple that with an attitude of worship towards the group's authoritarian leader, and otherwise common people can be convinced to commit atrocities. We've seen it too many times. And in the end, a jealous and vengeful person convinced people to act on her behalf under false pretenses, and in the name of enlightenment and salvation, and only when they couldn't save themselves did they truly see the light.